Okay guys, can you hear me and see the screen? Awesome. Okay, then then let's start. So yeah, the thing that I just said in the chat window was the more extreme that the reference is. Well, I don't know if it necessarily the more extreme the reference is, but something that gives you clear extreme shapes to play with, you might find more useful. So I'm going to be working from this one, and I think we'll see how it goes. But I think actually because the contours are not too far away from being naturalistic, that might make the sculpt actually much more difficult. Because if you're staying within the style, then it might just look like you're doing a bad naturalistic sculpt, and if you push it too naturalistic, then you're not kind of learning much from Schiele, or maybe you're limiting what you can learn. So something where you see his lines like really kicking into life and really having a lot of unexpected movement with them, that I think is going to be make it easier for you to sculpt, but also it allows you to get a better understanding of the character of the line that he's looking for, right? Because I mean, this is what I was talking about in the demonstration videos. Like you have something like the biceps having that dip in like there, or the width of the bone through there. It's like he's observing the character, and then he's just taking that and pushing it as far as he can, you know. So let's see. I'm going to try one somewhere in the middle, and we'll see how it goes. So starting just like normal. Excuse me, making something basic for the ribcage and eggs, ribcage and hips, making an egg for the ribcage, and just make sure you keep these on the thin side, right? The hips in the female will be wider. He's not making the hips super thin or anything like that, but the ribcage, certainly you don't want to have that too wide. That was something that a mistake I made when I was starting the demonstration sculpt, and managed to catch it in time, and it made a big improvement. I made it much closer to his work when I changed the thickness of that. So as always, looking for egg shape, opening up this, but I'm gonna let this, because I'm doing a female, I'm gonna let this bow inwards, right? So on a male, push outwards. Remember Frazetta really opening that up to 90 degrees and having it razor sharp on his heroic males. Well, I'm gonna let it fall in a little bit through here. And then flatten off the egg shape up there, and then make sure it's nice and eggy from the side view. And then really digging in for the spine, so we really get that M shape. Okay, something like that. Other than it being fairly thin, Schiele isn't doing anything that weird with the ribcage. You can see, like in the reference that I've got, finds it pretty simply, not really doing anything too weird. Although if you have a front view, there is something strange that he does where it's like the bottom of the sternum is here, so the pecs would be there, and he draws the bottom of the sternum a couple of inches lower than that, kind of maybe where the xiphoid process would finish. I'm not sure why, but it seems to be consistent in his work. Okay, and then some hips. I'm going to do this based off of this bucket conception. Make a bucket, make sure it's flattened front to back. Same as like with the egg, right? We're flattening that from front to back. We do the same with the bucket. Chop off the front. Get a nice arc. Top view. Pull it inwards where it's arcing up. Then rotate them, and with time being of the essence, you may want to leave it at that. I'll push it a little bit further. Just find the opening through here, and find the segment through the back. Now, of course, this being a female, we want the hips to be slightly wider, so you see how narrow the hips are. This is a much more Frazetta sort of Frazetta male kind of relationship that I've got going at the moment. So I'm gonna, well, the hips overall feel a little bit small. So 1 head high on the male, 1.5 heads high for the rib cage, and then 1.25 heads width for the male. Right, same as the rib cage. On the female, I'm pushing that out wider. I don't see Schiele doing that to excess, but I'm gonna just see if I've got another female nude, just so I can try and spot a pattern in how he's doing it. No, he's really not pushing that to excess. The hips are noticeably wider. You've got a female figure, but within the boundaries of what you'd expect to be realistic. Notice that generally speaking, he's increasing the distance between the ribcage and the pelvis. On the male figure, he's doing it massively. I don't think I've seen him stretch it that far in a female figure. It could could just be that I can't remember, because in these two he's not. He's stretching it, I would say, a little bit beyond what you would expect, but really not very much. Yeah, his handling of the female form actually much more naturalistic than his handling of the male form. Okay, and then the rest I think I'm just going to fill in with, in the demonstration I used a cube to fill in the middle section of the body. Because, you know, this was on like a figure like this, right, where you have that huge distance there between those two areas. But even then, I'm not sure a cube was the right thing. He finds, you know, sort of rounded mass for the belly. You can see here on this female how if I reduce the size of my brush, you can see her belly is just going to fit in perfectly there. And he's using, on this female, he's using a red color to differentiate areas of fat. You can see the breasts being slightly redder, and then you can see the belly being redder. Yeah, kind of pretty interesting how he's using color in an anatomical way. I look at that in the demonstration, and I don't see him doing it so much in the main reference I've got here, and there's just that idea of the redness for fatty areas through there. Oftentimes as well, when he's doing the female genitals, he'll make them really red, you know, just to really like heighten the eroticism of all of that and really draw your eye to it as well. So yeah, I'm not really sticking with the square shape through here, because I know that he's going to move to fairly rounded forms fairly quickly. Okay, now let's just start posing all of this. So one thing that I was mentioning to you guys when I was doing the feedback earlier this afternoon, the Raphael feedback, is make sure that when you snap to a view, whichever view you're snapping to, that it lines up with the reference image. Don't expect it to line up perfectly, because, you know, you've got the ZBrush perspective, which is kind of like fake perspective, and you're comparing to, like in this case, a Schiele drawing, which will have completely made up perspective. So don't expect them to sit in line perfectly, but at least by being able to go back to the same place every time, you're making it a little bit less difficult for yourself. And that's the thing, is this stuff is hard, so you have to do whatever you can to make it a little bit easier for yourself. Another thing that makes it easier, by the way, is to have your reference and your sculpt at similar sizes. So here, something like that. Basically, the more that you have to fill in your own mind, the more difficult it's going to be. So it might be that you even go to the extent of setting up a camera, and then so every time you snap to that camera view, it's the same angle and it's the same size. So one interesting thing about Schiele is these kind of, generally very vertical, very horizontal, strong compositions. The image on the left is not doing that so much, except for the leg that's coming out directly to us. But here we've got the arms pretty much just on a horizontal, and the legs pretty much just on a vertical there. So don't be tempted to play this like a sort of very classical contrapposto. It's not going to work well within the style, you know, unless you see that's what he's looking for. But I somehow doubt it. So those arms I'm going to conceive of as like a cube together, you know? Does that make sense? I think so. Something like that. Now, when I'm not going to include a head, I think this composition should work fine without it, and I'm not going to include the supporting child. By the way, as I look into that supporting child, I'm having difficulty reading its face. I'm not quite sure what to make of that, but I'm identifying it as male because of the way that Schiele handles the form. So you can see like that distance between the ribcage and the pelvis, that really extended distance. I read that as like a Schiele shorthand for male. So that's my assumption there. I think compositionally, I might want some kind of thing there to support her body, but let's see what happens if I don't. Anyway, once I've got the main movements, hey, welcome, Kat. Once I've got the main movements mapped in from this view, it's really important that before I start going into and working into it, that I'm switching to a side view, because there's going to be a temptation to just stick that all in a straight up and down sort of movement. And that might work fine for Schiele. Most of the time it'll kill you, but you know, like we've said, Schiele works with these pretty horizontal compositions, but I still think, yeah, a lot of the times you're going to be dead in the water there. So so keep an eye on that. So in this case, I'll have the legs pushing forwards and then moving backwards. And then maybe really having a forward lean on the rib cage. And maybe really making sure the hips are angled back. Okay, yeah, I think that should work. And yeah, keep an eye on the twist as well. So you see there's a twist in this pose because her hips are not completely facing us, but they're facing us-ish. I don't know what angle that would be away from us. Let me just check what I've got in my hips. Yeah, something like that angle. And then that rib cage, yeah, now I can rotate that away from us even more. So yeah, I think the twist doesn't really bite you in the face in Schiele's painting. He's playing with it a little bit. You can see the way he's playing with the lines through here. It's allowing that line to feed through to there, and it's giving you a feeling of the twist. But I think that's something that sculpturally would work pretty well. Because this is the thing, when you're working from the 2D reference, you have to figure out what's going to make it work in 3D. And Schiele and whatever artist you're studying might not give you the answer to that. I'm stretching this out way too much. I'm treating it like a Schiele male. Now, so here's an interesting thing with rhythms in general, is when you stretch them out too long, or when you stretch them out long, not necessarily too long, then it's like a piece of string, right? That when you stretch it out, it starts to straighten up, meaning that the lines become longer, more graceful, more elegant. And if you make it overly short, then the opposite happens, right? And the lines really push outwards. And it's not that one is better than the other, you just need to be aware of it. So for something like these sorts of movements that Schiele's looking for, you might want to have it too long in general, so that the lines get a little bit more stretched out. But for someone like who we've been looking at, well, for when we look at Rubens, then you'd probably want those lines too short, and then they're really going to start coming to life. Okay, I'm just adjusting my conception for the rib cage by including a neck, just pulling that out. Remember, the neck leans forwards. It's a forward-leaning cylinder. Hopefully you're sick of hearing me say that, but it's important. Everyone makes it pretty straight up and down, and it gets you into trouble. Yeah, I think something like that could work. Right, so it feels unbalanced, and that's why I would need a supporting structure in there. I know that I've pushed it further than Schiele's pushed it. I'll meet him in the middle here and bring it back a little bit. But if you're identifying with your sculpt when it's just a collection of forms, right? When it's just abstract shapes, really, then that's a good thing. That'll ties in with what we spoke about in the abstract composition module. This is essentially what we're looking at. Doesn't matter how much form I add to that, how many little details I add. If this doesn't work, then the main thing is never going to work. Okay, so then let's make something out of that. So one problem that you're going to have immediately, or one challenge that you have to face immediately, is how do you depict, or how do you work with Schiele's handling of line when there is no direct translation of that into sculpture? And there's no right answer to that. That's your interpretation, right? That just comes down to design. I feel like it wasn't as difficult a problem, at least in this sculpt that I did for the demonstration, wasn't as difficult a problem to solve as I thought it might be. But the general rules here, and I think it holds in most of his work, is you just find the bone and you just make that as sharp as you possibly can, and you make it as obvious and make it stand out as much as you possibly can. And then, yeah, he doesn't necessarily shy away from the other forms, but I noticed when it started to break is when I started to make it just a little bit too detailed, a little bit too anatomical. So it's kind of, you have to find this sort of middle ground. And as you're finding the middle ground, don't allow it to just get into a generalized smushy softness. You have to go really bold with your choices. So you have what your big shapes may well be fairly horizontal and fairly vertical. Generally fairly bold and forthright, however you look for them, right? And then your medium shapes, as determined by the smaller movements of the bone, through there, again, that's where you get your sharpness. And then with the muscles, well, they'll play into fairly strong medium shapes as well. And so your smaller shapes, that's the challenge, because he's doing it just with line. And you can do it, you could experiment just with line, by the way. There are sculptors who do this very well, right, who just carve lines into the surface. It's one way that you could play it. I didn't. I tried to find a kind of sculptural equivalent, but it's up to you. This is exploration, I guess. So the challenge that I think I'm going to have here on the female is how to handle these more rounded forms, because I didn't have that challenge on the male. I was able to get away with everything being pretty abrupt and pretty sharp. His depiction of breasts is actually very naturalistic. I mean, more naturalistic than both who have we looked at so far, than both Frazetta and Raphael. They both have the conceptions of breasts that are stylized one way or another. And weirdly enough, Schiele, for all his kooky stylizations, leaves the breasts pretty much untouched. So that would be flat surface on the top, sharp curve underneath. I mean, yeah, you can even see in this image on the left, he's closely observing the weight of the fat as it pulls down to the side. I don't think you'd ever see a Frazetta boob doing that, you know? Frazetta boob would just constantly defy gravity. So yeah, sharp, flat surface on top, sharp curve underneath, and then look for the transition from bone through to the muscle of the pectoral, which I'm not going to be able to depict through here because the arms are going to cross over. Although, looking at my reference, I should be able to do it. He's got the breasts much lower on the reference. Okay, I'll match him. So the thing is, I feel like if I hadn't observed that, that would be bad. Like, if I didn't notice that he did that. Once you notice, then it's up to you, right? Then it's your decision to go, do I take that or do I not take that? This will tie in a little bit with, based off of a question that Alex asked with the homework, with the Raphael homework. I talked quite a lot about using reference in the first homework video. And I think, yeah, maybe at some point we should do a sculpt along looking at like a facial likeness or something like that, where you have no choice but to work really, really diligently from reference. Because it's kind of important, but there is a trap that's waiting for you there, which is that you end up just being someone who can only copy reference and can't kind of create. So, you know, in cases like this, it's like you have the freedom to do what you decide, and you have to do that because you're interpreting a 2D image into a 3D image. You have no choice but to put yourself into that, because there's, you know, yeah, there's no machine that could ever be invented that would do that. There'll be machines, of course, that could do an interpretation of it, but that's what it's going to be. It's always going to be an interpretation. So because of that, you need to observe, like, are you missing the rhythms? Are you missing the bones? Are you missing the things that Schiele was looking for? And then once you've observed that, then it's up to you whether you want to take it or not. And that's the freedom. So here I'm going to find the belly, and I am just going to hit that as a sphere. That's almost certainly going to change at some point, or at least, you know, I'm going to have to relocate it or do something, but I'm just establishing my visual language and resisting the temptation to make everything too naturalistic. Because that's the fight, you know, once you know how to make it naturalistic, then it's like, okay, well, how do you not do that? There's also the fight, by the way, once you get good at working from reference, then it's then you have to know when to discard the reference and not copy it too closely. And it's much easier to do that when you're not good at using reference. As soon as you get good at it, then it's a pretty dangerous territory. Okay, the iliac crest, or the acis specifically, see there on the image on the left, he's just hitting that incredibly hard all the time. So as I start to work this up, I will have moved away from my mass conceptions, right? I'll have moved away from what I established as my hips and my rib cage. I would recommend, if you're doing the homework assignment, that you aim to move back at some point. And it actually burned me quite badly on the Frazetta sculpt. I don't know, I guess I was just too lazy to move back, and you know, I'd really struggled to get this huge rib cage that Frazetta puts on the male, and yeah, I ended up just with a bit of a weird, distorted thing in the end. So one way you can avoid that is just at the end going through and putting in putting in your mass conceptions, and I would certainly recommend that for those of you guys who work more freely, you know, which I admire, and I think is a good thing, but then you need to find a way to control it. So yeah, if you're just freestyling and just playing with forms, then at the end go and stick something in there and see whether it fits. Okay, in her shoulders we can see a little bit of this this kind of crazy line that he likes to play with, so I'm going to look for that, and look for it in the arms as well. Generally speaking, there's this weird thing, we can see it on the image on the left of the screen here, where he just takes the deltoid off, right? Because if you take the deltoid off, you have the movement of the humerus underneath, which is crazily important for capturing the feeling of a shoulder, especially the shoulder of a relatively thin person, because you can understand then how that bone pushes forwards. So it's like, if you want to understand that, then I recommend you take the deltoid off. I mean, then for a naturalistic sculpt, I would recommend you put the deltoid back on later, you know, and that's the bit that Schiele's just going, no, it's fine without it, you know. So what's happening here is, you know, I'm looking for all of the same stuff, right? Lumbar masses, the bone of the spine of the scapula there, just pushing it a little bit more sharply than I would, of course, in a more naturalistic sculpt. Here, the iliac crest, you know, the exact same stuff. Like the things that are going through my mind aren't a million miles different to what they would be if it, you know, had to be like a photoreal thing. It's just then, what do I do with the line? You know, like, what is the characteristic of the muscle, and do you want to take that? Do you want to exaggerate it? Do you want to subdue it? And that's all design, you know, and ultimately, even if you're doing something photoreal, well, you can't escape from your own natural tendencies anyway. So at some point, even if it's only a tiny amount, you're still putting in this natural stylization. So better just to be aware of it and be in control of it, and then learn to enjoy it, you know, and learn to see the power of what you can do once you're what, like, openly looking for it and responding to it. So yeah, one nice thing that you can get from, I think, most of Schiele's studies of the back is the boniness of the back, right? Which is a thing that I'm always pushing you guys forward, always going like, okay, there's serratus, there's lumbar, rhomboids, those are the deep muscles, right? And then you can layer on trapezius, that's latissimus, you can layer on latissimus, you can layer on trapezius, but they're going to be very thin. The shape of the back is defined by the bone, and that is the rib cage plus the scapula. God, my rib cage feels kind of broken there. You see that flatness there? I think that was probably a lazy... Oh, I don't know what's caused that. Well, anyway, point is, you really get to feel the boniness of the rib cage here. The egg shape of it. So when you work in the opposite view, you're kind of like in no man's land, right? Where do you, how do you handle the forms? Where do you place them? And so use your view that is matching the reference to figure out your visual language. And any sculpt you do has a visual language, even if you're aiming for photorealism, right? How do you handle the tendon in general? How do you handle bone? And you need to have some kind of consistency between those. How do you handle fat and you know, skin and whatever else? So once you've kind of figured out those rules, and yours will be different to mine because your interpretation of the 2D form into 3D may well be different. And then as you get through to the front, you need to find that consistency. So if I'm saying that bone is really sharp, then maybe the bottom of my 10th rib is sharp through there. And then through here, it depends. Like I said, Schiele has this strange thing where it's not just Schiele. I've noticed it. Quite a few people. Frazetta does it as well. The bottom of the sternum is there, and they give a visual impression like it's several inches lower. So I'm going to work with that. I haven't figured out why you'd want to do that, but seems to be a fairly popular thing. It's generally not the best idea in the world to do something if you don't necessarily agree with it, but you know, you've also got to try stuff out. But like, for example, if I'm giving you guys feedback and you don't agree with my feedback for whatever reason, then just don't do it. You know, it's like there's nothing to be gained. Like if you just do a thing because I'm saying or anyone's saying to do it, it's not very useful. I mean, it could be that you don't get why I'm saying it, and then that is what it is. Oftentimes when I've been in that situation, sometimes I realize like a year or so later, or it could just be that you disagree and you go, no, I want to handle the forms like this. It's very important that you kind of define yourself as the master of your own work. Don't think I've ever seen Schiele sculpt, or draw or paint an oblique muscle. Or the latissimus, actually, now that I think about it. No, he has. I've seen like him give indications of the latissimus, something like this. But basically, like, you know, those are thin muscular forms, and he just doesn't seem overly concerned with thin muscular forms, right? He's just someone who's all about the bone. Having said that, I've certainly seen him pick out the trapezius, but the trapezius does have some thickness to it, especially in that middle area through there. He finds the top of this top triangle of the scapula. I actually think that you probably see that more in life than I give credit for, so I'm going to keep an eye out for that. And that's one way of learning these forms is like, you know, if you're studying from someone and they look for the form, especially like an artist who uses anatomy well, they look for the form and you go, well, I didn't realize that you would see the form like that. And then it kind of draws your attention to the fact that it exists, and then suddenly you start seeing it everywhere. You know, as soon as like it has a name, as soon as you label it. Looks like he's going for a really thin neck through here. Yeah, I think that'll work. So again, I'm zooming out a little bit here. So, you know, like I was saying, the ideal whilst you're working is that your sculpt is matched to the size of your reference. But then you want to zoom out at times. Right? If this was a clay sculpture, I'd be saying leave. Well, not leave. Although leaving is good as well, like leaving the room, coming back. But I'd be saying stand 2 meters away from it and spend 80% of your time there, because then it means you're just looking. You know, you're just looking and observing. And you know, let's say take at least 5 minutes. I don't know how you guys play these sessions. Whether you're just like, I'd imagine the nature of them would be that you're just frantically sculpting away, and you know, and then you're just kind of trying to catch glimpses of what I'm saying in the meantime. If that's the case, then, you know, which is understandable when we have a short turnaround time, but still try and find some 5 minutes. Once you've got what we could call your canvas, once you've got something blocked in that represents your sculpt, sit back and just go through it, you know? Go through maybe the neck. How would you describe the neck? Shoulders, how would you describe them? Big gesture, maybe how would you describe that? You know, and then see what the description you would give that is compared to what your sculpt is, and see whether those things differ. as I come around to the side, I'm just going to look for the roundedness of the bum through here, which is not necessarily what I would do on the male. On the male, I would look for a similar movement as I do on the breasts, right? You go flat on top, that's obviously exaggerated, that feels like an older bum, but flat on top, sharp curve underneath. But then here I'm looking for a curve, and not quite as much as Frazetta would do, but it looks like I've hit quite a lot, so I guess some of Frazetta's style has seeped in. But yeah, female bum cheeks are going to feel like they defy gravity just a little bit more, and that's because of the hips being rotated out, but also the fat storage being more evenly distributed across the cheeks, whereas on the male it's going to hit the bottom more, which is, by bottom I mean the bottom of the bottom, right? Okay, so as I've taken a step back through here and I'm kind of going like, yeah, I feel like I've hit the gesture and stuff, but I realize that I'm still under. Right, if I look at that line of the hips, see that angle through there, and I look at mine, like that's a good 5 degrees off. That's a large amount to be off. I think I don't need to rotate the hips to do it. I think I can just play with how the form is pushing out here, but yeah, once you've got stuff blocked in, don't kind of go, okay, my gesture's locked, and now what? Like, nothing gets locked, right? So, and the closer you get to the end result, the easier it's going to be to see things like gesture and movement and rhythm, see whether those things are off. So yeah, take another look at that. Most of the time you'll find that you're underplaying it. One thing that I'm conscious of, by the way, as I do this is I'm enjoying the sharpness that I found in the scapula there, but I'm conscious that feels like it's from a different sculpt to the bottom there, and I need to find a way of unifying it. It could be that it's not just the sharpness of the scapula, but the flat planes of the actual arm that I'm hitting through there. So it might be softening that is going to help, but it might be that I need to start looking for the movement of the bone just a little bit more to try and unify that in the back there. No, I was wrong. The hips did need to rotate. Just looking at the line of the vertical fold of the bum there and going, nope, it's not it. It's more that. Now she's really falling over. So I'm going to oppose this and straighten up the hips here. And I'm willing to believe that there are people that just nail the gesture to start with and never change it. But I would say those would be the minority of people. Right, the vast majority change it as they work. And people who work in quite a loose, illustrative way are normally quite good at getting the fullness of the gesture, right from the first brushstrokes or the first decisions they make. But then they're going to have the challenge of, okay, how do you lasso those? How do you gain control of those as you get closer to a finish? And if you're underplaying the gesture, then you have the opposite. It becomes easier to get a kind of something that feels maybe real, but you just you risk it being completely lifeless. Excuse me. Okay, I'm gonna start playing with the arms a bit. Look to depict the deltoids as non-deltoids, more or less, just bony bulges. And then so here I've got a challenge because I've started with something so so loose and so conceptual. This is where, if I'd started with like a bony block in, it would be easier, but it's okay. Easier is not necessarily better, especially when it comes to learning. So here I'm just going with my gut instinct on the length of the humerus, which is 1.5 heads, which should be the same height as the ribcage. So I have an actual thing that I can check off if I need to. And then I know that within this style, I probably want the bones to flare out a bit, so I'm going to look for that. Especially the medial epicondyle, because that's its personality. And then with the fingers, even when he's dealing with a more delicate form, actually, there is a slight difference on the way he's handling the fingers on these two females. You see the one that I'm working from, he's happily going for the blockiness, the really square ends to the fingers, which is kind of how you would caricature them. On the one on the left, he's using the nails to allow the fingers to taper, but he's still going really strong on the bone through there. Now I'm actually just putting my pen down to hold the pose myself for a bit to try and figure out what her left arm or left hand is doing, to see whether it can go on top of the arm or whether it should go on top of the arm or whether it should go underneath. Okay, it's interesting. I'm kind of hugging myself to try and feel it out, and I feel like if both of my arms go on top, which I think is what he's depicting, it just feels like if I open up my fingers like she's doing, then I don't have a grip on my arm, and it doesn't feel like an actual pose, whereas it would if it was held in place by the other hand and the fingers were coming out underneath. So that's what I'm going to look for. And that's all to say, take the pose. Right? It seems like maybe an obvious thing, but we hardly ever do it. Right? You're trying to depict a model in a certain pose, and you just don't do it. And it's like, well, try it, and try and hold it for half an hour and see what hurts. And that'll tell you what muscles are active and where the weight is. I'm being a little bit brave here if I do go in and start pulling out the fingers, because it's similar to like if you put on a head and you put a face onto the head. It's like, okay, well you better get that right, or else it's going to look crazy weird. I suspect I might be more in there, just like the weird territory. And also, yeah, it's going to be an interesting challenge to like go, okay, how do I not make her feel like she's just at the end of like a rap video, you know, just like doing her stance like that. I don't have an answer to that just yet. And it could be that's why I put the hand on top. I don't think that was on Sheila's radar at the time, but it's on mine. So I don't know. That's still a design problem. You know, you're still problem solving as you're trying to figure that stuff out. And yeah, I've got these arms just fused as two things through there. So if that one's going underneath, something like that. This one comes out, and remember the hand is just all bone. Right? If I switch back to the demonstration sculpt that I did, like here, I was just going, yeah, bone, really sharp movement through there for the where the carpal mass finishes. So this is where the bones of the forearm finish, then carpal mass, then just going bone, 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 just slamming bone everywhere, because that's the visual language that I set up. And unless you're doing one of his more curvy sculpts, or you're sculpting from one of his more curvy paintings, then you're probably going to find yourself with a similar visual language. So just get out some sort of flattening brush and start working with that. And then find your elbow and really find the sharpness of the bone. The great thing is that when you go back to a non-stylized sculpt, you don't really want to be thinking about it in such a different way. Right? You go to your bone, find the bones, and then just string some muscles to them. It's really not a million miles different. I think partly what I can do to fight the kind of hip-hop video feel to this is to get that tension in the fingers so it's not like they're just dropping down. But this kind of idea of a puppet hand, it's going to work great if you have a hand on a surface and you can just give an indication of where that hand is and allow it to bleed into the figure a bit. Yeah, that's normally going to work really well. Problem is, when it's cutting out into the silhouette, there's no cheat, man. There's just the form has to look good, and that's that. And sometimes it takes time, you know, and that's why generally speaking when I'm doing a speed sculpt, you're not going to see me doing much with the hands in there. Depends on the nature of the hands, of course, depends on what they're doing, but it's like, yeah, you have the technical challenge of getting the topology working or whatever, and then you've just got the design challenge of all the rest of it. So here it's like the fingers are slightly rotated, or the hand is rotated. Yeah, do you know what? Changing my mind. So when I held the pose, it felt weird to not have that arm tuck in underneath. But then when I look at it, I'm going, no, I'm not sure that that's going to make sense. I don't know if it's going to make sense when it's on top either, but you don't know until you try it. And there's an important rule there as well, like, or not a rule, but like, you have to try stuff, and you have to be aware that, and this will be super important if you're doing concept stuff, that you have ideas in your head that sound really good, and you just don't know that they're crap yet, you know, but you will find out when you try and create form with them, whether you're drawing or painting it, or sculpting it, sorry. And so that's a really important thing to come to terms with, because then you need to get to a way of thinking where it's like, I need to find out as quickly as possible whether my ideas are good or not. And you can probably do that by getting them out there. So you need to kind of try and create a shorthand for just a way to just get those ideas out there as quickly as possible to know whether or not they're going to work. What's much more difficult is when you only know whether it's going to work or not once it's been refined a bit and once it's had some time spent into it. Because then you've spent the time, and by the time you've spent the time, you're attached to the form, so you can't just kill it if necessary. But most of the time, if it's not working once you've got the main beats in there, then it's not going to work. I know, it's still super hip hop. I've got no idea what to do about that. I'm going to ignore it, so I'm not just battling that challenge the whole time, and I'm going to smooth that off just so it doesn't dominate everything else. But it's something that, you know, I'd have to be aware of. If I was wanting to take this sculpt to a finish, I have to tackle that problem sooner rather than later. It's a really common thing that, like, it'll happen a lot with heads. Students will leave the head to the last minute because maybe they tried to block in the head and it was actually not looking so great, and so then they just kicked it back, and then on like the last day of the sculpt, they put in the head, and suddenly like they're fighting all kind of problems because you need to work the whole sculpt up together, right? You don't know what it looks like until you have all of the components in. So what I'm saying here for this is that I'm probably not going to add on the head. Well, I'm not going to add on the head. I know that for sure. So then I can appraise it like this. But then I'm saying, okay, one thing that I'm probably going to do is to add in a support, because without the support, you just get the feeling that she's falling over. So for me to go on any further now without adding in the support, I think is not a good idea, because you only know what these things look like once they're all in there. You know, it comes to the same idea we were just talking about. You only know that your ideas don't suck once you've tried them out. And especially when it comes to composition. Like, I have this all the time. I have these ideas that I could swear that they were good. And it's only through trying them that I realize that they're not, you know. That gets quite difficult when you're working with a client, because the client won't realize that, you know, they will have explored their ideas in their own heads, and they won't realize, or that they might not be receptive to seeing them not work, and then you're just kind of forced to get this thing that could never work to work. Just could be a reason why, you know, most films are pretty bad. Yeah, you see, so as soon as I put in that support, it's kind of like, that changes everything. Everything, because without it, it's like, okay, she's falling over, but, you know, you have this strong S-curve silhouette. As soon as you do that, it becomes a more like a blocky-based composition, and the story has changed, because it's like she's sitting on this thing, which isn't happening here, right? And in Schiele's, it's an interesting thing, because it's just, I don't know what this crazy story is that he's working with, you know, but she's like being pushed upwards, and I guess, yeah, I guess the support of that child wouldn't be enough to hold her up, but as a visual support, it's enough for it to feel like she's not falling over, which I'm pretty sure she would if you took that away. So suddenly I have a problem to solve here that I didn't know I had to solve. It's like, okay, do I want her to feel like she's falling over? And if I don't, then I need to figure out a way of solving that. That wasn't an intentional thing. Okay, so. So what I'm experimenting with is just having it touch her just in a couple of places, because essentially that's what the child is doing. So even though I'm not going to create a child, I want to try and create something that's giving her the same amount of support. And then I also need to figure out a way to make it feel like it's part of the same sculpture. Do I try and work with some of the same visual language? Do I literally combine them and let the lines blur a bit where they touch? I don't have an answer to that either, but the thing is, like, everything that we do is, you know, within this field is essentially creative problem solving, right? So here the problem is very, very super creative, but then if you're doing a traditional sculpture, the problem might come later, where, well, you have this problem and then you have the problem of how to cast it. In visual effects production, you'd have the problem of what should the topology be, how is the rigging going to work, you know? But and these are very different problems to a lot of the problems we talk about. But essentially, it's all just creative problem solving. So it's that kind of muscle that you want to exercise. I think part of getting better at that is learning to iterate, right? Just try something out, and then it doesn't work, try it out again. because yeah, I can't currently find a way for this support, this base to work. An answer exists somewhere, but I haven't found it yet. And I'd have a few ways that I could try and explore that. One is to keep on changing this, and I might find the answer there. The other would just be to try out different things. And I really recommend you practice that. You know, if you're struggling with a certain part of the anatomy or whatever, just do it as 5 different sculpts or 10 different sculpts or whatever. You know, I think that's, if I'm working with a client, that's what I have to do. If a concept isn't going the right way or whatever, then let's just get out 20 silhouettes as quickly as possible and just see if, you know, the answer would be somewhere in there. And I could do the same thing with this, by the way, just work it out as silhouette. If it works in silhouette, it doesn't necessarily mean it'll work in 3D, but it might give us a jumping off point. Well, that takes us to nearly the full hour. So I'm going to just